Well, good morning, everybody. As I introduce myself, I'm Steve Reeson. I'm from the Food and Drink Federation. I'll say a bit more about FDF in a second. But when I was asked to come along by Savas to talk today, I can't remember whether this is my title or Savas's title for this talk of Strategy and Approaches for Energy Demand Reduction in the Food and Drink Manufacturing Sector. So my answer is, well, how long have you got to do that? So what I'm going to aim to do today over the next sort of 10-15 minutes or so is just to give you a very quick run through of some of the things that basically are on my desk and we within the FDF are thinking about in terms of energy efficiency, and try and highlight some of those points where we've got the interaction with the innovation agenda and the work of the centre. So what I'm going to do is give a quick bit overview of the sector, the manufacturing sector, talk a little bit about energy demand within the sector and costs of that energy and emissions. And then, because it's so important to us as well, a quick overview of some of the key policy and regulatory drivers in the sector on energy efficiency. Although you'll see from a very scary overhead that'll be coming up, that's a bit of advance warning for you. I'll only be focusing on a couple of areas. And then probably more out of all of that, what's evolving is getting more important is how we as manufacturers are getting involved in the wider value chain of food supply and some of the interactions between different players within that. Right, just a very quick, quick overview of some of the key points of the sector. We're actually quite a big sector, represents 60% of the UK manufacturing sector. And in terms of the scale of size, in terms of the economic contribution, it's equivalent to near amounts of the aerospace and the automotive sector combined. And often that gets overlooked, particularly on some of the policy drivers, on the policy side of things. I'm not going to go through each and every one of these, but obviously you'll get access to the overheads and you can always ask questions about them. We have over 6,000 companies and businesses within that. Interesting thing, 96% of them are micro to small businesses. So there's a very, very wide range of sides, from the more familiar multinational companies to a lot of very small businesses with very relatively low turnovers, but very innovative within the sector. We're a very big employer, over 400,000 people. But I think the more interesting figure we've got over there is between now and 2020, we estimate that we'll need 170,000 new employees within the sector. And that is across a very wide range of skills and talents, not least particularly in that high-level engineering skill. So whilst I appreciate today there's a lot of you from academia here, maybe a career in industry is something you may also like to consider. Sorry, Savas, I'm poaching, aren't I? Okay. And so the final infographic there is a lot of activities and work we do within FDF. The one I'm very closely worked in, and I'll talk a bit more about in a minute, is our work on emissions reduction. And as a sector, we've cut our emissions by over a third since 1990. And also down in the bottom right-hand side there is that innovation and research and development is actually key and fundamental to the sector, both internally within the company, but also in collaboration with centres like yourself and other partners. Okay, just moving on to, before I do that, this is just a quick overview of some of our members. As I say, there'll be a lot of very familiar ones to you there, including from well-known multinationals to a lot of SME companies as well. Okay. Right, move on to some numbers and some graphs. Just a little bit of information here about, well, how much energy do we use in the manufacturing sector? And you can see from here that, so this goes back to 2004, energy demand. As a sector, we use somewhere in the region of 35 terawatt hours of energy. That's primary energy, roughly split between electricity and fossil fuels. And as you can see, there's some interesting trends going there. And I think the two that really stand out to me, one is through basically a lot of rationalisation in production and energy efficiency, big moves on the gas. The interesting one is the electricity one, which has been pretty flat for many, many years, and it goes flat much further back than that. And you think, well, has nothing happened there? I think the answer behind that one is a coincident balance between upward pressures on electricity demand through automation and new systems within production, but also big changes in the frozen and chilled markets, so bigger demands on refrigeration within the sector, and also across the retail and the service sector as well. And against that pressure, yes, you have been getting better improvements in energy efficiency, more efficient refrigeration systems, etc. But it's quite an interesting trend, and as you'll see as I evolve it on to what we'll be talking about later, the low carbon roadmaps, it's be interesting to speculate how that goes further forward. Now, obviously, as a manufacturing sector, we're very interested in energy prices because there's no getting away from the fact the cost of energy is a big driver on energy efficiency on the use. And over the last 10-year period, most prices of certainly electricity and gas have doubled over that period. But the key one, obviously, is how much do we end up paying for this electricity? And as a sector, our bill is somewhere just over the £1.4 billion per annum and is projected to rise quite considerably over the coming years, particularly with all the new reforms that are coming in for the introduction of the low-carbon electricity generating system. And again, when I get onto the roadmaps, you'll see some of the implications that would have of the challenges we're going to be facing on decarbonisation within the sector. Okay, that's the cost side. A little bit about the emissions side of things. This is how emissions within the sector in terms of CO2, and this is CO2 from energy use, so I've not included refrigerants and that kind of thing here in this graph here. But actually, this is a really good story to tell, because since 1990, the sector has cut its CO2 emissions by over 40%. A lot of that is to do with fuel switching, particularly from coal in the early 90s and oil, but it's also to do with energy efficiency, it's to do with innovation, it's to do with things like combined heat and power, new refrigeration systems that come through in the system. And again, that's a good story so far. The challenge now is where does that go forward? Okay. Right, this is the heads up on what I said was going to be the very scary slide coming up. But I'm not going to dwell on this because we could spend a long time there, but any questions later, please come and grab me. But what I want to do is just sort of show to you the policy landscape that we as food and drink manufacturers have to operate in. Right, there's the food and drink manufacturer in the sector there. We have our friends in Brussels, and through them they introduce their own high-level targets. At the moment, it's a 40% reduction by 2030. Within that, there is a whole suite of activities and regulations from emissions trading schemes, energy efficiency directives, F-gas regulations, etc. Those translate into the UK into specific things, ESOS, Energy Saving Opportunity Schemes, mandatory energy audits. We can't forget the UK, of course, with our own carbon budgets, which are legally binding budgets for the UK, leading to an 80% decarbonisation by 2050. And within that, we have a suite of policies in the UK, climate change levy, climate change agreements, carbon reduction commitment, greenhouse gas reporting. We have a whole suite of incentive schemes, renewable heat, energy efficiency strategies. And also, I mentioned before about the impacts on decarbonisation of the grid. There's a whole raft of activity there, feed-in tariffs, carbon price support. So what we're operating here is a very, very complex and interactive landscape in policy and regulation. But there's two I'm going to highlight here, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time in a second talking about them, to give you some idea about how we think about energy efficiency at a sectoral level and the kind of things that we get involved in. And those are going to be the climate change agreements, and increasingly, very importantly now, is the 2050 roadmap. A bit warm today, isn't it? So I need a drink. A little bit about the climate change agreements. These are voluntary agreements, basically in return for the incentive of a discount to the climate change levy. For meeting energy efficiency targets, there's that balance between the two. So if you meet your targets, you get the discount. And over the first 10-year period, from 1990 to 2010, say this is the one for the Food and Drink Federation Climate Change Agreement, which is about, in terms of emissions coverage, is about half the sector. We actually had a very successful time over that. So over that period, we actually cut emissions by 1.4 million tonnes of CO2. Energy, we dropped by 6.5 terawatt hours. Energy efficiency improved by over 20%. At the same time, that throughput went up by 3%. So that was a very good story behind that. It also knocked some £300 million off the sector's energy bill as well. Okay, that's great, but that's in the past. Where will we going forward? I'm not going through all the numbers here. This is just to illustrate the kind of process that we go through in setting the targets and how we went through. Now, climate change agreements were very much about how can we improve the efficiency of the kit we've got in the factories at the moment. And we looked at, there's 14 technology categories there, whether it's refrigeration, it's boilers, direct fired ovens, and sure, if you're working in the food sector, a lot of this will be familiar to you. And out of this, we did a lot of work through a survey of over 850 sites to understand who had done what kind of savings they were getting, what kind of payback they were getting, and then projecting that through to 2020 as to what kind of cost-effective savings we're going to do. So that, to a large degree, that boiled down to actually quite a simple graph, which again is very pertinent to the way we approach these things, is you have a technical potential, but you also have a cost-effective potential as well. And that's very important there, because typically within the food and drink manufacturing sector, they say, well, what kind of payback times will companies work to? Actually, for a lot of companies, it's probably 12 months, 18 months, because they're under a lot of pressure and competition to use those funds elsewhere. But this kind of analysis has allowed us to come up with an idea of where those savings could come and at what cost those savings could come from. So that let us set as a new set of targets going through to 2020, which is an 18% improvement in energy efficiency. We've just gone through the first target period reporting, and whilst the results haven't published, I can say we're pretty much on track to meeting that, although as time goes on, you've done the easier stuff, and the harder stuff, which requires that bit more thought and innovation, starts to come into play. Okay. That was the climate change agreements. Now I just want to take a slight sidestep there just to cover a couple of things before I go to talk about the low carbon roadmaps, which are probably one of the most important things that are happening in the sector at the moment. The first one is just to give you an appreciation about food and drink manufacturing. And I can say this because I spent the first 18 years of my career in the oil industry before I moved into food and drink here. And sometimes I feel that the only thing those 6,000 or so companies have got in common is they make things that people eat and drink. And certainly within the sector, it's very diverse. And the technologies and the processes used within the different subsectors are very important, can be very different. So they need different technological solutions, different approaches, and different balances. A good example would be in flour milling, which is down on the bottom right-hand side. You'll be able to read this better when you get the hands out. That is essentially 95% electric motors for grinders and conveyance systems. But that flour is then going into the industrial bakeries, where 80% of the energy use is in ovens. So different technologies, different approaches to doing that. And this was a key thing that we needed to get over to government when we were looking at the roadmaps. The second thing I wanted to mention was this is some work we had done within FDF, was published it the year before last, was looking at through where were the key areas of innovation challenge for the sector. And I said that there's a publication that gives more detail on that. And this was done together with, it was Innovate UK, and I can't remember the other partner, but you'll have to remind me later. Key areas there. But as you can see, energy, water, and importantly, when it comes to supply chain issues, waste minimisation, and for future manufacturing the future were key technological areas for work that we wanted as a sector to focus on. Just to move on to the roadmaps themselves, these were set up over the last 18 months, and it was jointly funded by Department of Business Innovation and Skills and Department of Energy and Climate Change. And what they wanted to do was look at 8 industrial sectors and say to them, what do we need to do to decarbonise you by 2050? And that included the food and drink sector. And these reported back in March, and increasingly these are very much what we see as the framework for the discussion going forward about where the drivers, where are the technological, innovative needs of the industry, of the manufacturing sector to help deliver that. It's quite a high-level document, and as I said, I'll say it up front here, I think high-level document from your perspective is a good idea because it gives you a lot of scope to say, well, where can the work of the centre and other groups, contributors to help deliver that, the decarbonisation of the sector. This is the baseline. Essentially what it's saying is that overall, as a sector, we're going to grow. UK population is growing, so it's a coincidence with that. And this is sort of a government assumption, is that about half our energy use is in electricity. Government policy says electricity is going to decarbonise, therefore there will be an emission saving from that, which is that very large pale blue sector there. So if we did nothing else, because electricity will decarbonise, the sector emissions will go down. But that only delivers emissions, it's about 4 million tonnes there, which is only about 40% of the journey we're on from the 10 million tonne baseline. Beneath that, again, as baselines, yes, there's some stuff there on really what we're going to be delivering under the climate change agreements, a little bit of biomass, a little bit of process design, all very vague. But I think what's more interesting is at the other end of the scale, what's called the technical max potential. And here, this produces some quite interesting issues for us. Again, there's a lot of grid decarbonisation. There's also a very large part there from heat. How do we deal with heat going forward? We're using somewhere, say it's about 18 terawatt hours of heat. How do we decarbonise that? Do we use biomass? Do we use heat pumps? Do we use low carbon electricity? And so again, there's big challenges there, but also I think probably the other two I just wanted to bring to your attention was two other areas there. One was process design, and sadly bad title that was put onto this, others. The process design was really trying to capture the idea of moving away from how do we deal with what the factories have got now to how do we design factories in the future that use less energy, are more cost effective and reduce emissions. And already we're seeing sort of anecdotal examples that are coming out in various sectors that when you've got new build site, new process lines, you can build them now using less than half the energy of equivalent plants these days. So it's that kind of thinking about the design of how you bolt the bits of technology together to get them to work efficiently. And the other area, sadly it comes under other here, was a few years ago there was a study called Industrial Energy Efficiency Accelerator Programs, and these were very focused on the individual subsectors I showed previously. And from our point of view, they were very successful, and they got really underneath the skin of some of the manufacturing processes and to understand what are the alternatives, how can you use less energy with them. And so typical examples that came out there were combustion air control systems in ovens, UV pasteurization, novel dry-on techniques at all, which if that doesn't fall within your area of interest, I'm afraid I'm not quite sure what would. So, but it's very open at the moment, so it's open to a lot of ideas and skills and thinking about how do we actually deliver on that. And in fact, I think potentially that is sort of underestimating the potential level of delivery on it. Okay. And the final one I wanted to bring into is just to highlight the point that, yeah, I've been talking about food and drink manufacturers, but we are part of a much wider supply chain. And so the colours here aren't brilliant, but you can see we're down in the bottom right-hand corner there. Actually, we're about 10% or less than 10% of the supply chain, a lot of it being in the agriculture, retail, hospitality and services, in the home, and also embedded in imports as well. And this is where we start, again, we touched on this in the roadmaps, about the interaction with the agricultural sector and the agri-tech programs, what impact do we do on the supply chain collaborative projects. And again, I know we're working with Savas and the team here, and also with the government RAP program as well, through their Product Sustainability Forum and what's going to be called the Courtauld 2025 Collaborative Framework, which will basically be setting targets for the whole supply chain that we as manufacturers and other players will contribute into that. And that's where such things as, what's the impact of reducing waste in the home going to have on the supply chain? Can we have innovative things we can do in manufacturing to make life easier for in the home as well? A good example I came across there is some work to be able to microwave a ready meal 1 minute less than present. And they worked out, given the number of ready meals that were sold, that saving was equivalent to all the energy used in the manufacturing sites that were producing those meals. So it's starting to touch on those supply chain. And again, this is a very rich and ripe area for some creative and innovative thinking. Hope I've gone on slightly longer than I planned there, but hope that was interesting, and thank you very much.